It takes a moment for me to realize where I am. Around me, the breeze brushes against my skin, my eyes fixing on the vast sea in front of me, the moon shining brightly against the tides. The darkness is familiar, the feeling of the sand under me cold and moist. How long have I been in this form? I can't seem to recollect how long I've been here. The only thing that I seem to remember is her. But it's always been this way. Time has meshed into a timeline without limit or even significance. It'd been this way for millennia until she came into existence. The centuries and things I've seen have become a pale comparison to the years I knew her. Recollections come and go of the different lifetimes and experiences I've lived, memories of aging civilizations and evolving societies that rose and fell. I can't remember the many names I've taken, the faces and forms that I was known as. In fact, I can't seem to recollect my first days on this earth, or how I even came to be. I simply was, a wanderer when the seas were young and the sun was new, and the first ancient few that learned to call on me, using fires and rituals, leaving me my first feasts and sacrifices. I was unaware of my existence until I was acknowledged, and the fear and respect that I provoked was alarming. I hadn't known of my abilities until I did as I was asked, to bring rain for the crops, to help with the diseased and the dying, and to bring down rivals and enemies. I'd grown curious to these beings, these fragile young things that were eager to live and survive, and implored me to be saved. I'd grown tired, however, and I'd leave to other corners of the world where I could be alone, until eventually I was found. And this would be repeated. I was given a different name, a different face, a different way to call on me. Sometimes I'd lose my patience. I'd grow annoyed and irritated at their behavior, and before I knew it, they were plagued by death and famine, and I did not understand their fragility until they were nearly wiped out. I'd know not of what became of them when they burned and rotted, and the silver smoke emerged from their physical forms into the skies above. Some I would see again, others were gone forever. It was this that piqued my curiosity, how it must be to know that your days are limited, to make the best of whatever was given to you, regardless if I helped or not. They played and enjoyed their present days surrounded by others like them, smiling faces and sounds that I recognized as laughter. I'd see this great sense of happiness as I came across an individual that would captivate them, and I'd watch as they would say the first words of devotion and continue to gentle caresses and kisses, something I didn't understand. They'd create families, a lineage that I'd follow throughout the decades and watch with sadness as names and people were forgotten. Why did I feel this? I could not feel as they did. I hadn't the body to access whatever joy or pain they'd felt, feel the physical touch and pleasures and turmoil that made these curious creatures. I ached to feel, to exist, to know what it was like to drink and to eat and taste, to love. What was this complicated thing they called love? In a strange night, I drifted into an old Sumerian city, and I'd heard the faintest song, a beautiful song, weak but true. And as I'd wandered through the labyrinth of the stone city, in a dark, wet dungeon, I'd found her, chained to a wall, a frail figure staring up through the barred window. The moonlight shined against her brown eyes, and a single tear drifted down her face. She sang, quietly, as if this was her only way to cope. When a group of men entered, I felt a sudden anger as they lifted her, unchained her, and dragged her out into the city. She had been sold as a slave, and as a man carried her into a wooden carriage, I saw she was taken away. I wanted to free her, and so with a simple thought, the carriage trembled, The wooden wheels cracked as they tumbled over a large stone. The men were startled, and when they looked around from the shadows, I formed a dark beast, hideous and monstrous, and the men screamed. They ran away, leaving the girl alone. "Don't be afraid," I wanted to tell her. I'd hear her again through the cities of Akkad and the Tigris rivers, her song becoming firmer and stronger, and from the people I'd hear the rumors of her remarkable abilities to heal. She'd been passionate with herbs and remedies, aiding the sick and slowing death. I'd seen her grow into a woman, her hair becoming long, her facial features majestic and ethereal. She was beautiful. She'd migrate with the Phoenicians to the white mountains of Byblos, and I'd hear her song again. I craved to speak with her, to help her and teach her, and show her how to mold her abilities. I had provided comfort when I could, the rain when it was hot, the sun when she was cold, a fire when she needed it. I grew fruits so she never hungered, and summoned storms when she was threatened. Yet, she never knew I existed. At least so I thought. "Who are you?" she asked once. "I know you are there. Show yourself." Startled, I didn't know what to do. In all my ancient years, I never knew I'd felt such a thing. With major concentration, I began to construct a physical form, from my toes and feet to my legs and abdomen. I'd sewn together physical matter from nothingness, weaving together the complexities of the human body to my chest, arms, fingers, mouth, nose, and eyes, and finally, hair. I emerged from the shadows and she turned and gasped. I didn't know if I looked horrid or beautiful to her. I never attempted such a thing. She stepped closer, looking intensely in my eyes. She had no words. She seemed terrified. With a trembling hand, she slowly reached for my face, and when she made contact, I felt nothing. I leaned against her hand, yearning for whatever softness or warmth she provided. When she spoke again, I felt a vibration. Her words hit me like a stone through water, my form rippling and drifting away. I couldn't hold this form very long, but I tried throughout the days that came. At night, I'd come to her, and her fear slowly subsided. I'd learned to form a voice, to speak to her. I'd learned her language and tongues so I could converse with her. It was difficult. "You've always been with me," she said. "You were the beast that freed me." "Yes," I answered. I'd quickly retrieved to my darkness and the shadows, for the effort needed to say one simple word was beyond exhausting. I'd come to her in the following weeks. Throughout the years, I'd teach her how to call on me, to simply think on me, and I'd be there. I'd bring her secrets from across the globe, the wisdom and developing cultures. I'd bring to her the herbs and remedies she needed and instruct her on how to make fire and rain with her mind. She'd write all she'd learned on her scrolls, drew complicated figures and symbols as I described to her what I knew. She'd learn to channel her emotion and temperament so that the elements aligned with her will. In return, she'd show me her world. She'd walk with me to the rivers and describe to me what it was like to feel, to touch, how the air smelled, and the fruits and wines would taste. I'd create a fire for her so she'd be warm, and as she looked at me, the fire would reflect mysteriously from her eyes. "I adore you," she told me. "If a day passes by without seeing you, I forget you." She handed me the fruit, and I bit into it curiously. I could taste nothing. She looked at me in a small, gentle gesture. She kissed me. How I ached to feel the touch of her lips. With time, I'd witnessed the miracle of her 2 daughters. I'd teach them the same secrets I'd shown their mother, and she'd pass on her scrolls to them for them to continue. She'd teach them the song I'd heard her sing in her imprisonment, a beautiful, aching song that called to me and mesmerized all that heard it. And the miracles would continue to awe the people. They'd migrate from faraway lands to be healed and cured. With the years, she became older and frail, and as I beckoned her that I could keep her alive and reverse the effects of aging, she declined. She made me promise her that I would never do such a thing to her or her daughters or anyone that followed, for mortality was their true gift. Her daughters gathered with their children and the many people that she helped and healed, and when she closed her eyes for her final slumber, I wept. The villagers looked around in sadness and astonishment as they heard the echoing of my preternatural cry. It rained for days, and I allowed the mountains to be covered in darkness for weeks as I mourned. Was this it? Was this the feeling of pain? I had become angered that I knew not how to control it or release it. Her daughters would tell me. It was a matter of time. I'd return years later, and I'd found that they'd become just as powerful and beautiful as their mother, and they sang to me the beautiful song which calmed me. They'd pass down the song and scrolls to their children, and their children, and their children after that. The scrolls turning into texts, the different languages, and they'd tell the tale of the man or woman that appeared, who would teach them medicine and magic, and would grant them their wishes and would protect them and their families. With time, however, the song would be forgotten, and it would fade just as my interest to visit them. The families had grown and spread throughout the world, to different cities and civilizations. Slowly, they'd forget me too. I don't know how long I slumbered, but when I returned, the world had changed. A new order and religion had risen and taken over most of the world that I knew. People were condemned for believing in something like me. They'd been tortured and killed. The temples that once existed for those like me were destroyed, and in their place new ones were built for their new god. I found it difficult to understand their new language and beliefs. When I drift north across the sea and onto the new land, I'd find women entrapped and tortured, awaiting execution. One particular girl seemed to see and recognize me, her eyes strangely familiar. Her body had been beaten and torn, her nails completely removed from her fingers. I felt an old rage return. As I went through their belongings, the evidence used in these horrific new traditions, I recognized the text and scriptures in an old book. They'd been from the old scrolls. She was a descendant of the old family. I heard horrific screams. I followed them to where they would continue along with a terrible commotion. Outside, I found a detestable scene of a giant crowd witnessing the burning of women alive as men in giant robes and hats watched hungrily and eagerly. The women screamed as her flesh blistered and burned. My rage grew unfathomably. I conjured a storm, summoning thunder, violent winds, and rain that began to destroy the city. As people ran, I unleashed my wrath upon them like ravenous beasts. Men and women screamed as I tore at their flesh, ripping apart limbs and skin, scattering them as a clear warning for those that dared to come near. I saved the road men for last. I allowed them to see me in a horrific, hideous form for them to fear before I devoured them. Wherever they ran, I appeared, a dark, menacing figure burning into their souls as punishment for what they'd done. I spared no one. I let the rain wash away the carnage. The fires that killed the women now extinguished. Horrific charred figures stood tied against tall wooden poles. As I returned to the girl, I allowed myself to take the form of a man. I freed her, grabbed the book, and took her away into the night. My sisters, she spoke. I could not save them, I told her. I saved others like her, those that were descendants of the great family, those that were condemned to die. I guided many into the new world, lands discovered across the Atlantic, and I'd watched the family grow again, the secrets changing in languages again, traditions formed into new ones. I'd teach those that truly deserved the old gifts directly, those who were wise and intelligent beyond their years, who knew the universal laws of karma and selflessness. The gifts were developed tremendously, some peering into the future, others moving objects with their minds. The family had become a large web of phenomenon around the world. I'd hear the songs and voices across the skies, different tongues and traditions, different rituals and ways to summon me or my different forms. I'd hear the drums and singing in high tea, as high priestesses danced and twirled in white dresses, the bells and chanting of candomblé in the jungles of Brazil, the shamans and curanderas of Central America and Mexico. In the north, covens would gather and call on the elements and directions as I taught the ancient few long ago, the powers of the four elements that bent to my will. Others were not aware of their own gifts, solitary witches with their unique songs and mesmerizing poetry and power of words, each word elegant, hypnotic, and potent, just as their spellcaster siblings. Some knew and recognized me. Others would call on other names. Others like me. I'd never seen them. I'd often questioned the existence of others like me, and when I encountered them, I was unable to see them, just as mortals could not see me when I didn't desire it. But I would feel them. Some were young, others old. Some were kind, others volatile. My encounter with them were rare, but when I would take human form, I'd feel them more intensely. Curiosity would fill them, sometimes anger for what I'd done. They'd say, I'd protect the great family regardless, whether they knew me or not. I'd walk down the streets and alleyways and towns and growing cities, always quiet with a watchful eye, only to disappear when they'd notice. And when someone would try to bring harm to them, I'd make myself known. And when the ones like me that are malevolent approached them, I'd demonstrate the endless extent of my power and told them, they are intended. And they'd vanish into darkness. When I wasn't protecting or overseeing, I was able to see for the first time the new societies with my physical eyes, adjusting to their new customs, styles and ways of speaking, and social merritments. I'd look at the clothing I'd wear with fascination, the styles changing often and eclectic. I had seen how the fashions would change from the Renaissance to the Romantic and Victorian era, to the great wars and the new rebellious youths, the music changing consistently, the power of words almost forgotten. The greatest astonishment came, however, when I tasted for the first time the drink and food that came into my mouth. On a busy night, I'd sat in a cafe in Paris, watching the people walk and stare back at me as I'd smile with excitement. I could taste and feel. I wanted to taste and feel everything, from every food and drink that I ever craved, to feeling the hot and cold against my skin, the feeling of another human being. Setting off to find these things, I'd experienced the exquisite plethora of human senses. I'd taste every fruit and wine, the breads and meats I'd often watch people prepare, the salts and spices and strange flavors I never knew. I'd lay with my first woman and man to enjoy the carnal riveting sensations of pleasure and pain, the wet kisses and burning desires, the loving caresses. It filled my being like liquid fire. I'd partake in a brawl on purpose to feel the crushing fists against my skull, and I'd laugh almost manically at the sight of my blood. I'd learned to project this form so perfectly, I had created a circulatory system with my own blood and a fully functioning heart. My heart. It pumped fiercely against my chest as the adrenaline rushed through my body and my arms and legs shook, my trembling hands feeling the thundering heartbeat. It felt like I couldn't breathe. I was ecstatic. The man who fought me looked at me in confusion. It finally came true. I was finally able to live like they did. I was human, but not completely. I had gone to the cinemas, to the live theaters, the orchestras, the museums. I had partaken in the club scenes to indulge in the beverages and substances that the youth were obsessed about. I had gone to see the concerts around the world to find the meaning and obsessions of the large crowds. It was strange. The music had changed, but I understand the sudden rush of euphoria that exhilarated the crowds. Still, no matter how long or far I searched, I did not find the old song and voice I yearned for. No matter who was at my side, who proclaimed their love and devotion to me, I ached for the one woman that commenced it all, my wanting to feel, to exist, to love. She'd been the mother to the magic and miracles we created, our gifts to the world. She'd teach me the reason to care, to feel empathy for this curious race, to fully want to understand the simple joys of living. I felt alone. A pain struck me, a different type of pain, hollow and empty, a strange yearning for her to still be here. My heart felt it. I pained for her. I tried desperately to remember her voice, the words of her song, the melody. I could not. I looked for her across the lands and seas, in books and scriptures, the moving pictures and music. I searched for the great family, for any that resembled her. All to no avail. She'd been forgotten, her name dissolved with the old scrolls long ago. I adore you, she'd say. If a day passes by without seeing you, I forget you. I went to the old world, to the white mountains, and traced the remains of the old cities. It had changed drastically. I grew flowers by the rivers in her honor. I'd even paint the sky in reds and violets and golds as she adored the heavens in them. I'd help the few that were sick, who were starved in the streets, remembering how she'd do the same all those years ago. I wanted her to see me now. But as the days progressed to months, to years, slowly, I began to feel myself fade again. From pure boredom, I returned to my human form. I wandered for days through the cities in the land I once knew as a kingdom of Marrakesh. I'd walk by the olive and cypress trees of the Minara Gardens, through the grand riad of the Bahia Palace, remembering the colorful and elegant wooden galleries. I continued wandering through the towns until I reached the coast of Essoria, I walked past the markets and restaurants until I hit the warm sands, and I sat, watching out into the sea until the sun came down. I watched and I watched, allowing my thoughts to calm, closing my eyes, listening to the void above. And then I heard it. A familiar tune. I listened closely to the words, and they came to me in a haunting trance. The words, unmistakably, the song I'd forgotten. The melody. It was hers. I stood quickly, looking towards the source. I began to walk, allowing my body to evaporate and then form again in a narrow alley. I walked, ignoring the people that gasped for what they just witnessed. I continued walking, passing the orange and red concrete walls until I reached a strange doorway. The borders were green and white with intricate designs. I pull the metal door and walk inside. There, I find her. In the middle of a surrounding crowd, she stands, holding a microphone, musicians behind her following her haunting voice, with eerie chords that match the ambience she exudes. The people looking at her in awe and almost devotion. She was different. Her body was thin and young, the modern world marking her. She had a different face, but as she looked at me, I saw the fire I saw long ago. The fire by the river, the fire conjured by her and the many after her, the fire that betrayed them. As I look around, I see that these aren't just people. They are all members of the great family. I see the different faces gathered from all over the world, a similar fire in their eyes. She smiles at me, the fire burning brighter, as if she knows.